Today, I would like to break down the structure of an API and explain exactly how an API functions. But before, we need to understand what is an API and what is it responsible for. Every application that we use can be separated into two distinct parts, the front end and the back end. The front end refers to the look and feel of the application. The interaction between the client and the application is handled by the front end. So every nice, beautiful interface that you can see on the application is handled mostly by the front end part of the application. What happens when you click on a button or when you start watching a video or you carry out any action on the application is handled by the backend and it functions in a different way. On this diagram, you can see various applications sending requests through the internet to a server on which an API is hosted. This API may then make use of different third-party service providers to make sure or to carry out some particular tasks necessary for your request to be fulfilled. After carrying out these actions, the API then responds back to the application in order to display the information or resource you are looking for, in case it was found. So looking deeper into the backend itself, let's say we have a domain name called cooledapi.com. that is being called every time we perform an action on your application. This domain is referring to a particular IP address, which is just a number used to uniquely identify the server on which your API is being posted. This API receives the request, then use the second part of the request, which may be used as, for example, stating that we are requesting to have access to all the users of this application. So the first layer that welcomes that particular request is the endpoints. The endpoints refers to the different entry points or applications. Let's assume that this second entry point is the entry point that is responsible for giving us information about every user. So the request will move from the endpoints or this layer, the next layer, which is directly below it, which is a cache services layer. This layer is responsible for quick response on frequently requested data. So when our API is frequently called by various applications, or it may happen that we store this information temporarily on a separate server so that it responds automatically or very swiftly whenever this same information is requested. If ever this information is not sufficient or is outdated, the request will move to the next layer. This next layer is the authentication layer. The authentication layer makes sure that the request carries the appropriate key that allows it to actually have access to our API or every resource or any resource on our API. So at this level, we extract the key from the request and validate that particular key in order to grant access to our server. If ever the key is not correct or is not validated, the request will simply be blocked in order to protect our resources, because this might be an attack. Next, we move to the role layer. At this layer, we identify the role of the user performing the request, and we make sure this particular user is having the authority or is actually allowed to access the information being requested. If ever the user is not allowed to access the information, we block the request and send an appropriate message. If not, the request is allowed to go through. At this level, if the request is not a creation or a modification request, we can reply with the previously stored data as we earlier said. If not, we move on to creating the particular resource or data sent by the user. So this action moves us to the next layer, which is the controller. The controller is responsible for deciding how this particular action is going to be carried out, making use of different services to perform that action or to carry out that action. So let us say this first controller is the controller responsible for carrying out every action related to users. So it might then use some services at this layer. We have services which are like workers interacting with other third-party services or databases and so on, which facilitate or which helps us carry out the action eventually. So the controller decides who is going to or how things are going to be done while the services actually do the work. So here we select a service that is actually going to fetch or help us fetch the information from the database. And let's say this service is a service having access to the database. It's then going to use access keys and keywords to perform some queries on the database, get the information related to the users, pass it and send it back to the controller. The controller will then take that information, then forms a response and responds to that particular request that was sent to us. And formulate that response in such a way that the front-end application will understand and you'll be able to interpret it correctly, displaying a meaningful message on the user's interface. So apart from database, we may have different services like an email service responsible for sending emails to the user, or a Google authentication, or a PayPal service, or as we earlier saw, the caching service handled by Redis. So these are the different layers that we generally encounter, we generally see in every API or API.